June 24th, 1948. The midnight hour passes over a fractured, starving city, Berlin, the former capital of a dead Reich, now a ruined island surrounded by a sea of Soviet red. In an office in the Soviet sector, Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, head of the Soviet military administration in Germany, reviews the final confirmation. The order is active. All rail, road and canal traffic from the western zones of occupation, American, British and French into Berlin, is, as of this moment, severed. The order is clinical. The intent is brutal. It is the first great strangulation of the new Cold War. Soviet intelligence, gathered by the MGB, the precursor to the KGB, is precise. The reports forwarded to Moscow, to Stalin himself, are confident. The western sectors of Berlin, home to over 2 million civilians and thousands of Allied soldiers, possess 36 days of food. They have coal for perhaps 45 days. The mathematics are simple. The Western powers have three choices: abandon Berlin in a humiliating retreat, attempt to force an armored column through Soviet-held territory and trigger a Third World War, or stay and starve. Sokolovsky and his political officers are not worried. They are analysts, they believe in numbers, and the numbers state that this new, impossible city, this Western enclave 100 miles inside their sphere of influence, will die. It will choke, sputter, and then beg for terms. The West, they are certain, will not risk total war for one city. The blockade is a checkmate before the game has even truly begun. The first days pass. The reports from Soviet agents inside the western sectors are exactly as predicted. Panic, hoarding, a run on the few remaining shops. The new currency, the Deutsche Mark, is seen as a foolish provocation. The trap, it seems, is sprung. Then, the noise begins. It is not the thunder of bombers. It is not the scream of jet engines, a technology still in its infancy. It is a low, constant, monotonous drone. From the Soviet airfield surrounding the city, pilots in their propeller-driven Lavochkin La-9 aircraft and older Yak-3 aircraft look up. They see them: American C-47 Skytrain aircraft, British Vickers Viking aircraft. They are transports. They are slow, fat and utterly defenseless. They lumber through the three narrow air corridors, each only 20 miles wide, that had been guaranteed by treaty. Sokolovsky's staff logs the activity. It is dismissed. A propaganda stunt, a futile token gesture. The Americans are putting on a brave face. A senior analyst in the Soviet command writes a memo. To supply 2 million people with the bare minimum caloric intake, 1,500 calories per day, would require at least 2,000 tons of food, every single day. This doesn't even account for coal. To keep the lights on, the water purified, and the factories from freezing, the city needs another 2,000 tons of coal, daily. The total is 4,000 tons. 4,000 tons airlifted every 24 hours. Soviet aviation experts laugh. The largest air transport operation in human history, the hump operation over the Himalayas during World War II, had moved a fraction of that, and it had been a nightmare of logistics and crashes. The Americans, the Soviets calculate, are using C-47 aircraft. A C-47 on a good day can carry maybe 3 tons. To move 4,000 tons, they would need over 1,300 flights every single day, landing and taking off in a ruined city with battered airfields. It is, in a word, impossible. It is a mathematical phantom, but the noise doesn't stop. It grows. Weeks turn into a month. July passes. Berlin is not starving. August arrives. The reports from MGB agents become less confident. They are confused. The markets in West Berlin are not empty. There is food. There is coal. There are reports of candy being given to children. The mood is not one of surrender, it is one of grim, bizarre defiance. Soviet air controllers are baffled. The stunt is not stopping. The transports are not just arriving, they are arriving with a terrifying, inhuman regularity. One plane every 5 minutes, then every 4. They fly in rain. They fly in fog so thick that Soviet pilots are grounded. The sound is now the soundtrack of the city, a constant, unending testament to a logistical equation that should not solve. This is the central mystery. The Soviet leadership, men who believed in iron, in steel, in numbers and brute force, are watching an enemy defy the laws of physics and economics. This single, impossible act of airborne supply threatens to undo their entire post-war strategy. If the Americans can do this, if they can feed a city of 2 million people with nothing but air, what else can they do? What phantom capability are they hiding? If you want to understand the full story of the operation that shocked the Kremlin and forged the future of Europe, be sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. The stakes are no longer just about Berlin, they are about reality itself. Stalin, in Moscow, demands answers. He is told it is a temporary surge, a depletion of Allied resources that cannot last. He is told winter will stop them. Winter, the great ally of Russia, will freeze the wings, blind the pilots, and break the will of the city. Soviet command issues new orders. This phantom must be disrupted. MiG-15 aircraft, the new Soviet jets, are not yet available in numbers, but propeller-driven fighters are plentiful. Soviet pilots are ordered to exercise in the air corridors. They perform aggressive maneuvers. They buzz the transports, flying wingtip to wingtip, hoping to intimidate the Allied pilots. They practice anti-aircraft fire near the corridors, a subtle threat of what could come. They float barrage balloons. The transports do not deviate. They do not scatter. They plow through the air, one after another, a ghostly, unending conveyor belt in the sky. The pilots of the Soviet Air Forces report back to their commanders. The Allied pilots, they say, are not behaving like soldiers. They are behaving like postmen. They do not react. They do not engage. They simply fly, land, unload, and leave. Their discipline is absolute. Their procedure is maddening. The mystery deepens. This is not a military operation. It is something else. It is an industrial operation, suspended in the clouds. The Soviet High Command, the masters of the 5-year plan, are watching their enemy erect an invisible factory over their heads. A factory that produces one thing: survival. And they have absolutely no idea how to shut it down. The Kremlin is a fortress of disbelief. The reports from Marshal Sokolovsky are no longer confident. They are tinged with a confusion that borders on alarm. The blockade, the perfect strategic trap, is failing. The city of Berlin is not choking. The Western propaganda stunt is now in its 3rd month, and it is not weakening. It is, impossibly, getting stronger. Stalin's displeasure radiates from Moscow. This is no longer a regional dispute over currency. It is a public test of wills, a direct challenge to Soviet authority in their own backyard, and they are losing. The order is given. Find the answer. The full weight of the Soviet intelligence and military apparatus is brought to bear on this single, droning mystery. The investigation begins. It is a frantic, disjointed scramble. First, the Soviet Air Forces are tasked with analysis. Pilots in their Yak-9 aircraft and La-9 aircraft are sent to patrol the edges of the corridors, to count, to identify, to understand. Their reports are filed, and a terrifying picture begins to emerge. The initial estimates were wrong. The Americans are not just using their old, reliable C-47 Skytrain aircraft. The droning sound in the sky is changing. It is deeper, heavier. The pilots report new silhouettes, massive, 4-engine transports. The Americans are committing their newest and largest operational transport, the C-54 Skymaster. The British are flying Avro York aircraft and Handley Page Hastings aircraft. Sokolovsky's analysts run the numbers again. A C-47 carries 3 tons. A C-54 carries 10. The entire equation shatters. The impossible 4,000 tons a day is no longer a fantasy. With a fleet of these new giants, it is theoretically achievable. But this new data only deepens the mystery. The problem is no longer capacity. The problem is efficiency. To move this tonnage, the Allies would need a plane to land in Berlin every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is the new impossibility. No airfield on Earth can handle that tempo. Not in perfect weather. And this is Germany. The weather is brutal, the fog is thick, the winter is coming. A single crash on a runway would shut down the entire operation for hours. A single miscalculation in the air would mean a collision. It is a level of logistical perfection that Soviet doctrine, which relied on mass and brute force, simply cannot comprehend. The investigation shifts. The MGB is activated. Their agents in West Berlin, who had been tracking political resistance, are given a new, urgent target. They are to infiltrate the airfields. Tempelhof, in the American sector. Gatow, in the British. They are to find the system. Agents pose as laborers. They watch, and what they report back to their handlers sounds like madness. They report that the Americans and British are not operating a military airfield, they are operating a factory. The planes do not stop. They land, taxi to a precise spot, and are met by teams of German laborers who swarm the aircraft. The engines are not shut down. The pilots are handed weather reports and a candy bar, and within 20 minutes, the plane is empty, serviced, and taxiing for takeoff. They report on maintenance. The Soviets, whose own air doctrine accepted high rates of attrition, are baffled. The Americans have flown in an entire maintenance depot. Spare engines, spare tires. They are swapping out engines in a matter of hours, not days. They are running around-the-clock repair and return operation that keeps the fleet in the air. This is the first piece of the legend. The bogeyman is not a secret weapon. It is a secret method. It is the terrifying, invisible power of American industrial logistics, applied to the air. The Soviet command, raised on 5-year plans that were often met by falsifying data, is watching an enemy that actually meets its quotas. Then, winter comes, the great Russian ally. The winter of 1948 to 1949 is one of the worst on record. Fog and ice blanket northern Europe. Soviet pilots are grounded. Their airfields are useless. Sokolovsky and his staff wait for the inevitable. The sound must stop. The airlift must break. It does not. The sound continues. It drones on through the fog, through the ice storms, through blizzards. The MGB agents report the unbelievable. The Americans are landing in weather the Soviets would not even walk in. They are landing in zero visibility. This is the second great mystery. How? The Soviet investigation now becomes a desperate hunt for a secret technology. The wrong conclusions begin to pile up, each born of a deep, systemic paranoia. The first theory is that the Americans have developed a fully automated landing system. A death ray in reverse, a radio beam so perfect it can guide a 10-ton aircraft through the fog and place it on the tarmac without human intervention. Soviet signals intelligence units are deployed. They scan the airwaves, hunting for these magic beams. They find nothing. They hear the radio chatter, the calm, procedural voices of American and British ground controllers. They hear pilots acknowledging instructions. It is not automated. It is human. This is even more terrifying. If it is not a machine, then it is the men. The Allies are using pilots trained to a standard that the Soviet Air Force cannot match. They are trusting their lives to a voice on the radio, guiding them down, second by second. The second theory is one of sheer brute force sacrifice. The Allies, the Soviets assume, must be crashing planes constantly. They must be losing dozens of aircraft and crews every week, and covering it up. They are paying for Berlin in blood, a grotesque trade of men for propaganda. The MGB is ordered to find the wreckage. They look, they listen for the sirens. And while there are crashes, the operation is indeed dangerous. The numbers are impossibly low. The system is not just efficient, it is safe. This theory dies. The third theory is political. The airlift is a bluff. It is not sustainable. It is a massive, expensive drain on the Western economies. And they are doing it purely for political theatre. Any day now, they will crack. Any day, they will come to the negotiating table. This is the theory the Kremlin clings to. It is the one Stalin himself seems to believe. All they have to do is wait. But as winter rages, the legend of the airlift grows. It becomes a living entity to the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin. It is the sound of their impotence. It is a machine in the sky that cannot be stopped. They have blockaded the roads. They have cut the canals. They have severed the rails. And the West has simply sidestepped them. They have gone over. The Soviet investigation has found no secret weapon. It has found no crippling flaw. It has found no automated system. It has found only a fleet of transports, a corps of supremely well-trained pilots, and a logistical system of such ruthless, monotonous efficiency that it defies their entire understanding of reality. The hunt for answers has led them to a horrifying, simple truth. The enemy is simply better at this than they are. And as the daily tonnage counts continue to rise, the question in Moscow is no longer, how do we stop them? But what kind of power are we truly facing? While Soviet marshals hunted for phantom technologies and MGB agents tried to decode a system that seemed to defy natural law, the truth was not hidden in a secret laboratory. It was being ruthlessly engineered in plain sight, centered not on a new type of aircraft, but on the mind of one American general. The shift in perspective begins in Washington, D.C. and in the American sector of Berlin. The crisis had fallen on the shoulders of General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor of the U.S. zone. Clay was a hard man, an engineer by training. He saw the blockade for what it was, a test of will. His signal to the Pentagon was unbending. "We will not be driven out of Berlin." But how? The initial response was chaos. The airlift, codenamed Operation Vittles by the Americans, began as a desperate scramble. Pilots from all over Europe were thrown into the corridors, flying whatever they had. 47 Skytrain aircraft, 82 paquets. They landed at Tempelhof, an airfield in the middle of a dense city, with pilots sleeping by their planes and mechanics working in the open, often in the rain. The tonnage was low. The organization was non-existent. It was brave, but it was failing. It was exactly the propaganda stunt the Soviets believed it to be. The American solution was not a new piece of hardware. It was a man. In late July 1948, the Pentagon made a call. The call went to General William H. Tunner. If America had a secret weapon for logistics, it was him. Tunner was a cold, aloof, brilliant systems analyst who happened to wear a general's uniform. During World War II, he had commanded the Hump operation, flying supplies from India to China over the Himalayas, an operation that made the Berlin corridors look like a Sunday flight. Tunner arrived at Tempelhof and was appalled. He saw chaos. He saw inefficiency. He saw pilots mingling with ground crews, planes being serviced slowly, a schedule that was based on hope. He did not come to command an air force, he came to build an assembly line. And this assembly line, this secret project, was the true source of American dominance. First, Tunner identified the core bottleneck. It was not the planes, it was the variety of planes. A C-47 Skytrain and a C-54 Skymaster flew at different speeds, carried different cargo, and required different parts. He made a ruthless decision. The C-47 aircraft, the heroes of World War II, were to be retired. The entire airlift would be standardized around the C-54 Skymaster. This single decision changed everything. Now every plane in the corridor flew at the same speed, 170 miles per hour. Every plane was stacked at precise 500-foot intervals. Every plane needed the same spare parts. Every plane could be unloaded in the exact same way. The aerial ballet was no longer improvised, it was choreographed by a single, relentless maestro. Second, Tunner focused on the ground. This was the ingenuity the Soviet agents could not understand. Tunner decreed that no pilot was ever to leave his aircraft upon landing. The factory model was born. A C-54 would land, taxi to its designated hardstand, and be met by a precision team. A mobile snack bar on a jeep would drive up to the cockpit, handing the crew coffee and a donut. A weather briefer would hand them their return flight plan. And a team of German laborers, desperate to save their city, would unload the 10 tons of cargo. Tunner timed it. He set a goal, 30 minutes. Soon, they had it down to 20. Third, Tunner attacked maintenance. In the brutal German winter, engines failed. Instruments iced over. The Soviet assumption of high attrition was logical, but Tunner made it obsolete. He created a system of progressive maintenance. He flew in an entire corps of mechanics. They didn't wait for planes to break. They serviced them on a schedule. He set up a rotation. After a set number of flight hours, each C-54 was flown out of Germany, all the way back to specialized depots in Great Britain or even the United States, where they were completely overhauled and sent back. He was treating multi-million-dollar aircraft like interchangeable parts. Finally, Tunner solved the impossible problem of the winter fog. The Soviets were looking for a magic beam. The truth was a combination of technology and iron-willed human procedure. The technology was ground-controlled approach, or GCA radar. It was not new, but its application was revolutionary. In trailers at the end of the runways at Tempelhof and Gatow, controllers huddled over glowing green radar screens. They could see the planes in the fog, dots of light descending. The ingenuity was the system they built around it. Tunner mandated that all flights were to be Instrument Flight Rules, IFR. It didn't matter if the sun was shining. Every pilot, on every approach, flew by his instruments, not by his eyes. When the fog came, nothing changed. The pilots were already trained. This was the source of the calm voices the Soviet signals intelligence had intercepted. A GCA controller would lock onto a C-54 inches the soup. "You are 3 miles from touchdown." On course. His voice would crackle in the pilot's ear. "Begin standard descent. You are on the glide path. 2 degrees to the left." "Correct." "On course. On glide path. 1 mile. You are over the threshold. Look up and land." This was the American dominance. It was not a death ray. It was trust. It was the absolute, total trust of a pilot, blind in the fog, in the voice of a man he had never met, who was guiding him to a strip of concrete he could not see. It was a system of human integration, training, and procedure so perfect that it functioned like a machine. While the Soviets looked for a secret, the Americans had built a system. While the Kremlin clung to theories of sacrifice or automation, Tunner was orchestrating a symphony of standardized parts and perfectly trained people. The mystery that baffled the Soviet High Command was, in the end, the sheer, overwhelming power of American logistics. The winter of 1948 had been the Kremlin's great hope. It had failed them. The spring of 1949 became their moment of horrifying revelation. The Soviet High Command, from Marshal Sokolovsky in Berlin to Stalin himself in Moscow, had spent 10 months clinging to a single comforting theory. The airlift was a desperate, unsustainable act of political defiance. They believed the Americans were hemorrhaging money, burning out crews, and sacrificing their air fleet just to make a point. They believed that any day the system would crack. The investigation, which had begun as a hunt for a secret weapon, had become a grim accounting exercise. Soviet intelligence dutifully logged the daily tonnage: 4,000 tons, 5,000. By March 1949, the airlift was consistently delivering more cargo to Berlin than the city had previously received by rail and canal. The blockade was not just being beaten, it was being rendered irrelevant. But the true confrontation, the single shock moment that broke the Soviet will, was not a secret defector's report or a captured piece of technology. It was a public, audacious, and overwhelming display of power. It happened on Easter Sunday, April 16th, 1949. The day began like any other. But soon, Soviet air controllers listening in on the corridor frequencies and observers on the ground began reporting something strange. The sound, the unending, monotonous drone of the C-54 Skymaster aircraft, had changed. It was no longer a rhythm. It was a solid, unbroken wall of noise. The sky was not filled with planes. It was a single, moving river of aluminum. General Tunner, the master of the system, had decided to make a statement. He had organized a 24-hour surge. He called it the Easter Parade. For the Soviet analysts, the reports coming in were simply unbelievable. They defied all logic, all calculations. A plane was not landing every 3 minutes. A plane was not landing every 2 minutes. On that day, for 24 solid hours, the combined Allied airlift landed an aircraft in Berlin, on average, every 62 seconds. This was the shock. This was the moment the investigation's horrifying truth was laid bare. In one 24-hour period, the Western Allies delivered 13,998 tons of cargo, nearly 14,000 tons. They had delivered an entire month's worth of the impossible quota from the previous summer in a single day. They had flown 1,398 separate flights without a single major incident. The myth of the unsustainable stunt evaporated. The Kremlin was confronted with a terrifying reality. This was not a desperate gamble. This was a scalable system. The Americans and their allies were not just managing the airlift, they were mastering it. They were not at their limit. They were just getting started. If they could deliver 14,000 tons in one day, they could sustain 8 or 10 or 12,000 tons indefinitely. The blockade was not just a failure, it was a self-inflicted strategic humiliation. What was the Soviet response? What new missile was unveiled? What new jet fighter was scrambled? There was none. This was the most profound shock of all. The futility of their position was absolute. Their entire strategy was passive. It was a siege. The Soviets were the castle wall, and they had assumed the enemy would starve. Instead, the enemy had simply grown wings and flown over them. The harassment tactics in the air corridors, the buzzing by Soviet fighters, the accidental flak bursts had all failed. The Allied pilots, under Tunner's iron discipline, had been ordered to ignore them. They did. They treated the Soviet threats as weather, just another obstacle to be flown through. The only futile response left was the one Stalin had forbidden from the beginning, to shoot down a transport. The Easter Parade proved that the only way to stop the airlift was to trigger a Third World War. The Soviet Union, still rebuilding from the catastrophe of World War II, was in no position to fight the United States, which now held a monopoly on the atomic bomb. The Kremlin's investigation had finally led to the truth. The secret weapon was not a piece of technology. It was the terrifying, bottomless industrial capacity of the United States, harnessed by a system of ruthless logistical efficiency. The Americans had used Berlin to demonstrate that they could project power, sustain an entire city, and overcome any physical obstacle, not with a new bomber, but with a spreadsheet. There were no desperate countermeasures, there was only silence. Less than 1 month after the Easter Parade, on May 12, 1949, at 1 minute past midnight, the Soviet guards quietly approached the barriers on the Autobahn leading into Berlin. With no ceremony, no announcement, they lifted the wooden poles. The blockade was over, the strangulation had failed. The phantom in the sky, the great conveyor belt of American ingenuity, had won. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were not just statistics, they were the final, crushing verdict. In the 324 days of the blockade, the Western Allies had flown over 277,000 separate flights into Berlin. They had delivered more than 2.3 million tons of cargo. This is the killer statistic, the number that sealed the fate of the first Cold War confrontation. The Soviets had bet that the West could not supply a city. The West, in response, had built an entirely new supply chain out of thin air, one that proved more efficient than the railroads and canals it had replaced. At the peak of the operation, the airfields of West Berlin were the busiest on planet Earth, handling a volume of takeoffs and landings that dwarfed any commercial airport. The cost was staggering, both in treasure and in blood. 101 men, American, British and German, lost their lives in crashes, a testament to the brutal conditions and the relentless tempo. But the cost of failure would have been infinitely higher. It would have been the loss of Europe. This brings us to the macro theme, the true systemic failure that this one mystery exposed. The Soviet Union's defeat in the Berlin blockade was not a failure of intelligence, nor was it a failure of military will. It was a failure of imagination. The Soviet system, born of revolution and forged in the industrial terror of Stalin's 5-year plans, was a top-down command structure. It was designed to imitate and mass-produce. It could steal the plans for an atomic bomb and build one. It could copy a B-29 bomber and create its own. It understood force, it understood steel, it understood production quotas, even if they had to be faked. What it did not understand was logistics. It did not understand systems. The American response, embodied by General Tunner, was not a traditional military operation. It was a masterpiece of supply chain management. It was decentralized, flexible, and ruthlessly efficient. Tunner was not a general in the mold of Zhukov. He was a chief executive officer. His weapons were standardization, progressive maintenance, and statistical analysis. This was the great conceptual gap. The Soviets saw the C-54 transport aircraft as individual planes, vulnerable and slow. The Americans saw them as interchangeable components in a single, massive machine, a conveyor belt in the sky. The Soviets saw pilots as soldiers who could be intimidated. The Americans saw them as highly trained technicians, cogs in a system of absolute trust and procedural perfection. The Berlin airlift proved that the defining power of the 20th century was not just industrial might, but the ability to organize it. The Soviet Union could build 10,000 T-34 tanks, but it could not have conceived of, let alone executed, an operation that required such a perfect, harmonious, and voluntary integration of men, machines, and mathematics. They could command. The Americans could coordinate. This was the lesson that would echo for the next 40 years. The Cold War, it turned out, would not be won by the nation with the most tanks, but by the one with the most innovative and efficient system. The Soviet economy, rigid, imitative, and built on fear, was ultimately competing against a Western system that was flexible, innovative, and built on the flow of information. The airlift was the first stark preview of that competition's inevitable outcome. It was, in the end, a battle of imitation versus innovation. The Soviets could copy a machine, but they could not copy the mindset that had created it. Epilogue. The silence that fell over Berlin on May 12, 1949, was jarring. For nearly a year, the city had lived to the sound of engines. The constant, reassuring drone of the C-54 Skymaster aircraft was the sound of life, the heartbeat of a city that refused to die. When it stopped, the quiet felt like a loss. But the echo of those engines would define the next 4 decades of history. The airlift did not just save Berlin, it created it. It forged an unbreakable bond between the city's population and the Western powers, turning an occupied outpost into a defiant symbol of freedom, a bone, as Nikita Khrushchev would later rage, stuck in the Soviet throat. For the Soviet High Command, the mystery was solved, but the implications were a nightmare. The phantom in the sky was real. It was the full, terrifying weight of American industrial and logistical power, a power that did not need to fire a shot to win a war. They had tried to strangle a city, and in response, the West had shown it could move the world.